Hey guys, Dankey here. This is sort of a follow-up to the video I made about Noam Chomsky and how he was wrong in his opposition to Antifa with his claim that essentially uh, Antifa, in using direct action against uh, the far right, uh, would encourage them to retaliate with violence, and that this would sort of distract and divide the left and keep it from organizing and participating in like what uh, uh, Chomsky called truly constructive activism. Um, and my main objection to that was, of course, the nature of Antifa was one of reaction rather than proaction. Antifa was a reaction to the rise of the alt right and the far right elements in the United States. And so, absent those elements, there would not be an anti-fascist movement. I think that goes almost without saying. Um, and so, uh, one comment says, "I get where you're coming from, but I think you and Chomsky are both right and wrong at the same time. Change will only come with violence, but at the same time, we need to remember what we stand for. Losing our empathy is the way the right wins. Adapting right wing bullets for a left wing gun would work in our favor, but at the end, we need to change the minds of the right wingers slash centrists because they are being used. They lack knowledge. They lack the lack of real life experiences with other cultures, and the fear of being wrong creates this bubble that's hard to burst. They have this unconditional love for their ideas, just like we do. Um, let's see. I'll try to go like sentence by sentence because I think this is an interesting comment, and I want to try to respond to it. Um, Yeah, when he says change will only come with violence, but at the same time we need to remember what we stand for. I mean, I think we're always going to keep in mind that like the proletarian revolution stands ultimately for the elevation of like human life beyond just this sort of wage slave capitalistic hellscape that we currently find ourselves in. But uh, at the same time, um, we need to understand that there's a difference between, uh, the ideal and the reality. We have to understand that sometimes, in order to make real change happen, we have to get our hands dirty, and sometimes that means adapting tactics that would otherwise be immoral because arguing purely from a case of the ends justifying the means. That being said, that's no justification for like war crimes, war atrocities, crimes against humanity, that etc. etc. But when it says change will only come with violence, I'm not really that I'm not really convinced that that's true. I think violence is probably one of the main routes, but in our current age of like global interconnected capitalism, uh, were we to see like a proletariat revolution come across, um, just for an example, say just some poor undeveloped country in Africa, what few capitalist multinational conglomerates were sort of participating in imperialism in that country might just decide to cut their losses. They might not try to fund a rebel group. They might not try to, cause a coup, because they might just realize that, we don't, uh, we have plundered enough resources from this land, and it's just no longer cost effective for us to try to retain our capitalistic control over this territory. So, I think, um, in my uh, socialism and climate change video, I talked about how, uh, in the coming age of climate change, the global capitalist system is ultimately going to crumble, and uh, and it might not even take that long. Uh, After all, because it is so interconnected, the entire system is only one major crisis away from a collapse, a total collapse across the entire globe. So, you know, fingers crossed, but we may just see uh, the proletarian revolution come about by a purely economic collapse. It might just be the governments of the world realize uh, uh, the capitalist system has failed, and we there will essentially be coups in every major country that will ensure that we don't uh, go back or try to resurrect the system once it crashes. I mean, that's a very, very hopeful feeling, and of course, that's ignoring the fact that the government is largely supported by the big capitalists and consisting of big capitalists, and they would most likely cling uh, to their power with all that they possibly could muster, therefore necessitating a violent proletarian revolution. Um, but at the same time, I think uh, the countries where they don't have stable governments and where capitalism is still developing, I think they have real potential for a proletarian revolution when the global capitalistic economy experiences its next crash, because they sort of have the bargaining chip of, do you really want to spend all of this money propping up, say, like a banana republic or some kind of corrupt regime, just so you can make a few extra profits? Um, so Going back to this comment, it says losing our empathy is the way the right wins. I don't think that's the way the right wins. I think the way the right wins is by uh, completely purging society of all leftist resistance, and adapting it to their horrible fascistic worldview. I think, there is a certain uh, uh, admirable quality to leftist thought, certainly, that makes it much more superior than right wing uh, quote unquote philosophy. But and that is, of course, its capacity for empathy for others. But we can't let our empathy for our fellow man blind us to the plight of the proletariat. Regardless of whether or not the capitalist class consists of fellow human beings, they are human beings that have chosen, whether consciously or unconsciously, to participate in a system of oppression over an entire other class of human beings. So asking for empathy with capitalists is sort of like asking for empathy with, like, slave owners, if this was like the antebellum South in the United States. Um, it says adapting right wing bullets for a left wing gun could work in our favor, but at the end we need to change the minds of right wingers slash centrists because they are being used. Um, Using right wing tactics for a left wing gun could work in our favor. I don't think so. Um, I will do a separate video talking about why the left doesn't use terrorism in the same way that the right does, and just in general, um, uh, because I think that that's a topic worth exploring. It deals with praxis, and it deals with the means by which the proletariat revolution uh, can and can't happen. Um, he says, but at or she, but at the end, we need to change the minds of the right wingers slash centrists because they are being used. The lack of knowledge, the lack of real life experiences with other cultures, and the fear of being wrong creates this bubble that's hard to burst. They have this unconditional love for their ideas, just like we do. Um, I'll kind of go one by one. Uh, we don't really need to change the minds of right wingers and centrists because they are so reactionary and ignorant that they can't really we can't rely on that to be our main focus. If we rely on trying to change the minds of right wingers and centrists, we're already fighting a defensive battle at that point because we're already sort of um, saying, all right, we need to stop focusing on like praxis and taking the already like class conscious elements of our country and empowering them, but instead we need to focus on like building more class conscious elements. And while I'm not opposed to that, that's not to say I'm opposed to changing the minds. I mean, after all, that's part of my main focus with this channel. Is to hopefully shine a light and expose some of the hypocrisies of right wing and centrist elements on YouTube, uh, in the hopes of changing minds. But at the same time, that shouldn't be our primary concern as proletarians. As revolutionary proletarians, our primary concern should be to empower the working class. And right wingers and centrists, are constituents of the working class, unless you're a capitalist. But uh, nevertheless, they uh, don't have the class consciousness, and if anything, they're sort of antagonistic towards that class consciousness. So it's almost like, if I if I can be like all the MAGA right wing chuds and make a Matrix analogy, it's almost like in the Matrix how the agents could assume the body of any person who wasn't unplugged, and it's all wow. It's and so in this analogy, it's almost like in this case the right wingers are still plugged in, so therefore they're always capable of being co-opted by like these fascist reactionary elements. And while it would be nice if we could like reach across the aisle, you can never really be sure that they're arguing in good faith because they're always, you're always going to have to second guess them and wonder if they're just trying to manufacture some kind of like uh, um, uh, if they're going to try to just uh, um, spread their fascist propaganda instead of like actually listen to your ideas, because often in the debates I've had with right wingers, they are so interested in just parroting their ideas and repeating talking points that I've heard over and over again, and they're not really interested in listening. Um, let's see. They lack the lack of knowledge, the lack of real life experience with other cultures, and the fear of being wrong creates this bubble that's hard to burst. They have this unconditional love for their ideas, just like we do. Um, but see, I don't know if they really do, because like in order to really love your ideas, you have to really think about them. And I think a lot of right wingers only take like the most superficial surface level analysis of the kinds of um, the kinds of socio-political um, uh, facts that dictate their philosophy. I think they look at things like race and IQ statistics, for example, and from that they prescribe a whole number of very shallow, unfounded, and just complete, very loosely associated uh, mythologies tied to that. Like the example of like black people being naturally predisposed to crime because their IQ is lower, and from that you can extrapolate this sort of uh, white superiority, and from that you can glean this sort of like PC culture trying to uh, uh, supplant like the superior white man with the inferior black man. Just all of this extremely dumb reactionary crap. It's almost like they're arriving to their conclusions and then just trying to piece together logic uh, in order to justify it. It's almost like when you look at like creationists and um, they say, well, the Bible says that there was a great flood, so I'm going to look and cherry pick like all the scientific data, just sift through thousands of articles until I find one that mentions like a floodplain, an obscure floodplain somewhere way out in like Minnesota somewhere, uh, and I'm gonna say that proves the Bible. It's almost like that. They're finding evidence to suit the facts that they want. It's a complete ideology, as Zizek would say. It's a pure ideology. Um, so I don't really think they love their ideas. I think they just love the feeling that their ideas give them. Like, ooh, I'm so superior. I'm so I'm so much better than all the Jews and the blacks. Uh, it's not my fault that I'm a fucking loser living in my mother's basement or my trailer park, and it's not my fault that no woman ever wants to touch me because I'm a member of the white race and we're being persecuted. So, so anyway, that was a response to this. I guess you could call this video um uh well, I'll decide what to call it when I write the title because I can't think on the fly like that. So bye bye.